Everyone. Welcome to Finding Hope in Art and Activism. We're so glad to have you here. We'll get started in just a few minutes. In the meantime, please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. Let us know who you are, where you're coming from, let us know what inspires you, what art inspired you to take action, or just what inspired you to take action. Yeah, I'm Lofa Powell. I'm the development director at OCI. And we are so happy to have you here. We also have a bunch of board and staff on this call, so I invite board and staff to please introduce yourselves.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Anne. So good to see you. Good to have you here.
Has it started?
Yeah, we're going to get started in a few minutes. We're just saying hi. Oh, I love that stuff. Welcome. Lauren, welcome. So happy to see all of you.
Can you hear? I just hear white noise.
Oh, we can hear you, Amy.
Oh, now I hear you when someone talks. Otherwise, I hear white noise. Perfect.
Welcome, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started with the webinar. We're, again, so happy to see all of you here. Thank you so much. I love all of these people from all over the place telling us what inspires them, what gives them hope. It's just so wonderful to see. So welcome. Welcome to Finding Hope in Art and Activism. I'm Lopa Powell, and I'm the Development Director here at OCI, and we are all so pleased to have you here with us today, and we thank you for all the different ways that you support the climate justice movement and OCI in particular. So, in our different ways, everyone gathered here dedicates their lives to building a better world, and that work can be hard. The other day, I was listening to the radio while running errands, and the news I was hearing made me just, I don't know, so hyper aware of the constant pit that lives in my stomach. I mean, how many of you can relate to that? I'm sure so many. But then I changed the station and to music, and I was immediately felt some relief. And that's what we want to offer to you all today. An hour and a half of relief, but also inspiration, because while art can help us forget the troubles of the world, it can also inspire us to action. And well, OCI is all about action. So for the next hour and a half, we're going to bring together an incredible array of writers, artists, musicians, and OCI staff to talk about how creativity can be a catalyst for change and the ways that activism can be creative. But before we get started, I wanted to go over some housekeeping. So please do continue to say hi in the chat. We also have several staff members, like I said, and board members, many of whom have already introduced themselves. So I encourage everyone to just say hi, comment, get to know each other in the chat. We will have some time for Q&A with the artists at the end. So please put any questions in the Q&A tab of the webinar, and we'll get to as many as we can. So now let's get started with this incredible panel. To kick us off, I'd like to welcome an icon in the literary and activist world who also happens to be an OCI board member. Rebecca Solnit is a writer, a historian, and an activist. She's the author of more than 20 books on feminism, Western and urban history, popular power, social change and insurrection, wandering and walking, hope and catastrophe. She also writes regularly for The Guardian, and she is the co-director of the climate project Not Too Late and co-editor of the Not Too Late anthology. Rebecca will share some of her work with us, and then we'll pass it on to Elizabeth, our executive director. So welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for showing up. It's wonderful to be here. And I have to say, some of the news is inspiring. The Rocky Mountain Institute yesterday talked about just how incredibly wasteful and inefficient fossil fuel is for powering our lives, which is a reminder that, and this is what I'm going to talk about from an essay I wrote for the Washington Post a couple of years ago, that doing what the climate requires of us doesn't just fix a problem, it makes everything better, socially, economically, ecologically, and morally. So I get some of my inspiration as well as some of my dread from the news. And being part of Oil Change International gives me a way to do something about that news. And in the wake of the last election, one of the things that's given me heart is that we are Oil Change International. The US is not the world, and a lot of good stuff will happen at local and state levels in the US, but also continues to happen in other countries. And we at OCI will keep doing the work. So I wrote about abundance because we're so often told that we live in an era of abundance and that climate requires scarcity of us, austerity, renunciation. So I wanted to stand that on its head. I wrote, some of the reluctance to do what the climate crisis requires of us comes from the assumption that it mostly means giving things up. But what if it means giving up things we're well rid of, from deadly emissions to nagging feelings of doom and complicity in destruction? I mean, how many of you would be okay with giving up that? A monastic once told me renunciation can be great if it means giving up things that make you miserable, that do harm. The idea that we currently have abundance and what's required is austerity can be stood on its head. This age is miserable for so many in so many ways, and doing what the crisis requires could make many and even most lives better. To invert the assumptions means rethinking what constitutes wealth and poverty, well-being and its opposite. By other measure than goods and money, we are now impoverished. We, of course, is itself a tricky word, since, of course, the affluent minority of people on Earth now have an obscene amount of stuff, while the lives of the majority range from modest to desperate. But even the affluent live in a world where confidence in the future and in the society and worlds around us, the society and institutions around us, a sense of security, social connectedness, mental and physical health, and other measures of well-being are often dismal. Burning fossil fuel makes us poorer in many ways, as it fills up our atmosphere with carbon dioxide that destabilizes temperature and weather. It drives a crisis of despair, grief, and anxiety among the young, facing an uncertain future. Worldwide, breathing air contaminated by burning fossil fuel kills more than 8 million people annually and damages the health of millions more, particularly babies and children. Wherever fossil fuel is extracted and refined becomes a de facto sacrifice zone, from the Alberta tar sands to the contaminated rainforests of Ecuador, from the refineries of Louisiana to the West Virginia mountaintops scraped off for coal, to the contaminated Niger Delta in Africa. In the present order of things, most of us suffer from moral injury, the impact on the psyche of witnessing or feeling complicit in something wrong, or we avoid seeing and thinking about it and take on the moral numbing and willful obliviousness that is the avoidant form of moral injury. A deep sense of wrongness permeates our lives. We know that from our fossil fuel to our smartphones to much of our food and clothing, exploitative working conditions and environmental harm are part of their production. We see the US as increasing economic inequality, the desperate misery of those who lack housing or are crushed by debt, see the despair that fuels addiction, know that child hunger, even in this richest country, is a major issue. And we know the planet is in trouble, and that has particularly impacted the young, with justified fury, grief, and despair in recent years. The climate crisis requires some very specific things of us: a swift transition away from extracting and burning fossil fuel and towards renewables, improved designs for the built environment and transit, better care for the natural world in all the ways we interact for it. For all those things to seem meaningful rather than arbitrary requires understanding that we are parts of grand, intricately orchestrated natural systems that are both beautiful and irreplaceable. This knowledge that we are not separate from nature but dependent on it is already far more present than it was a few decades ago. And that, I think, is itself a kind of abundance, the knowledge that everything is connected, that we, however lonely we feel, are deeply woven into that garment of mutual destiny Martin Luther King spoke of, that we are part of nature, which is not how we thought about this 30 or 40 years ago in the dominant culture. From the shift to renewables to the shifts in consciousness, what we need is already underway, but we need to cultivate and amplify it until it's how the world works and how we understand that world. To do what the climate requires of us does mean giving up some of the profligacy of this era, some of its wasteful excess. But it's also an opportunity to rethink who we are and what we need and desire. What if we imagine wealth as consisting of joy, beauty, friendship, community, closeness to flourishing nature, to clean air and water, to good food produced without abuse of labor or nature, and security in our own environment and societies, along with confidence in a viable future? I think doing what the climate requires of us could bring about a quality of wealth for everyone, and the sense that it's for everyone is part of that wealth: a metaphysical wealth, a moral wealth, an imaginative wealth, a wealth of confidence, hope, joy, and love. And so while we at Oil Change International do really tangible strategic work on ecology and economy, on fossil fuel and funding, it's never divorced from these other things, from this poetic, imaginative, spiritual task of making a better world. And doing what the climate requires of us does make a better world, a more abundant world, a more joyful world. And so I think we need to mourn the destruction, but we need to celebrate the possibilities. And I will end there with thanks to OCI for letting me do this work.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Rebecca. I'm Elizabeth Bast. I'm the executive director at Oil Change International, and I'm really excited to be here with you all today. We're looking forward to the conversation that we're about to have with some amazing writers, artists, and activists. But before we dive in, I just wanted to spend a few minutes giving some background on our work at Oil Change International and how we see art and cultivating hope as important pieces of climate activism, particularly in the challenging times we find ourselves in. So as many of you know, Oil Change International is a research, communications, and advocacy organization. Our overarching goal is to advance a just and equitable fossil fuel phasing out fossil fuels to avoid the worst climate impacts, but also to protect the communities that have suffered injustices in the face of fossil fuel production. We base our work in foundational and some of our foundational analysis. Our ground and as well as principles that come from our experience with the oil industry. In 2016, our groundbreaking Sky's Limit report found that potential carbon emissions of fossil fuels in already operating mines and fields would take us above 1.5 degrees of global warming. And our new analysis shows that the potential carbon emissions in developed mines and fields could take us above 2 degrees. And so this leads us to our focus on stopping fossil fuel production, in addition to supporting clean energy to achieve climate goals. And then our decades of experience with the oil and gas industry also demonstrates how much harm oil and gas production brings to communities and the environment, and how little the industry is contributing to development. At OCI, we're data-driven and people-powered. We produce cutting-edge research informed by our deep expertise in the oil and gas industry, and we use this analysis to speak hard truths about where we are and where we need to go to achieve a just transition. We also focus on building the strength of the movement through cross-movement collaboration, coordination, and strategic thought partnership. And we are justice-oriented. We support and amplify grassroots campaigns and voices. We combine our research and people power with communications and advocacy, running targeted campaigns to change policy, institutions, and the media narrative. And as I'm sure you're all aware, we're facing a particularly challenging time for work on climate and fossil fuels, particularly in the US, as well as for justice, human rights, and many related efforts. But we're really committed to doubling down on our work in the US and globally across our organization. We're continuing to work to transform the institutional landscape, to enable a just fossil fuel phase out and policies. And over the next month, we're working to squeeze every last possible action out of the Biden administration. But moving forward, we're looking to adjust our strategies to get governments and institutions around the world to take action in the face of the incoming Trump administration. We'll turn to the state and local levels in the United States. We'll build power over the coming years and be able to take advantage of the opportunity for policy change when it comes. We're going to keep working on challenging the fossil fuel industry and its enablers. We're leaning into facing the industry head on, challenging greenwashing, calling out bad actors, naming the impacts of the ongoing oil and gas expansion, and exposing the false solutions that perpetuate the industry. And we're also focusing on work to support the movement and frontline campaigns to stop fossil fuel projects. We will continue to support with research and communications, and lean in as well with our support of environmental defenders and others who are likely to be more marginalized in the current political environment. The climate threat is increasingly urgent. There's still time to change course. And it's not that this is a black and white, we win or we lose. It's a continuum. We have to keep doing as much as we possibly can to limit the impacts. And so we will keep working as long as we have not kicked this problem yet. And it's not, I don't want to sugarcoat anything. It's going to be really hard the next few years, particularly in the US. But we're here. We're going to fight like hell. We know we can move forward. We know every bit of forward movement counts. And there are many, many of us here who are working together and ready to build what's next. And we're finding motivation today and in the future for the challenges we face through our work, through our allies and movement partners and community, but also through creativity and art. And we're very excited to come together, show our resolve, this sharing of words, of song, of art and poetry. And this is the work that builds the people power to drive the transformation we need. So that's why we're so excited to have this conversation today, specifically looking at finding hope in art and activism. I'm really thrilled to introduce our facilitator and our speakers for this discussion. Amy Goodman is going to be our facilitator today. Amy is an award-winning journalist and host of Democracy Now!, a daily global independent news hour broadcasting on over 1,500 TV and radio stations across the US and around the world. Amy's won numerous awards for her reporting, including the DuPont Columbia Award, the George Polk Award, the Society for Professional Journalism Sigma Delta Chi Award, the Harvard Nieman Foundation for Journalism's I.F. Stone Medal for Journalistic Independent Lifetime Achievement Award, and the Right Livelihood Award. Amy has reported from around the globe, often from conflict zones overlooked or ignored by corporate for-profit media. and she co-writes a weekly column with Dennis Moynihan, syndicated by King Features, and is the co-author of 6 New York Times bestsellers. And I'll just introduce the rest of the panel and then hand it over to Amy. Nnimmo Bassey is a Nigerian activist, environmentalist, architect, author, and poet who chaired Friends of the Earth International from 2008 to 2012. He currently leads the Health of Mother Earth Foundation, an ecological think tank and advocacy organization. In addition to numerous other awards, he was one of Time Magazine's Heroes of the Environment in 2009, was named co-winner of the Right Livelihood Award in 2010, and was awarded the Rafto Prize in 2012. He has served on OCI's board since 2021 and been an invaluable resource for our work. Hilja is a Norwegian singer and songwriter, writing folk-inspired jazz pop. Her music describes both her experience with climate activism as well as thoughts on friendships, love, and how to do a somersault. Her debut album, Hvor ble regnet af? Where Did the Rain Go? Was a conceptual album thematizing climate sorrow. And in 2023, she released the EP Sinspika Mad Girl. Hilja studied jazz singing at the Norwegian Academy of Music, and she is currently working on her second album. Aneesa Khan is a senior communications officer with us at Oil Change International. Aneesa joined the climate justice movement by organizing for climate reparations at the UN climate talks, where she worked to make sure the voices of vulnerable Black, Brown, Indigenous, and Global South youth were heard loud and clear over those of polluting industries. Prior to joining OCI, she was a youth activist for many years, as well as an organizer with Friends of the Earth International, the Wilderness Society, and Sustain Us, a youth-led climate justice organization where she served as the executive director. Aneesa specializes in telling stories of environmental inequity and injustice through graphic design. And you've already been introduced to Rebecca Solnit, writer, historian, activist, and also our OCI board member. And so with that, I will warmly welcome our speakers and turn the conversation over to Amy Goodman.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and wonderful reading to Rebecca. It's such a joy to be with all of you. You know, I don't think we can afford the luxury of giving up. And as Rebecca said, this is an international movement, and you never achieve democracy. You have to fight for it every day. And there are remarkable ups and horrendous downs. But the key is we're all in this together. And it is such a pleasure to be with all of you. I saw some of you just recently, a few weeks ago, in Baku, Azerbaijan, at the UN Climate Summit, the COP. And you know, here we were in a repressive petro state. Last year, UAE, and the head of the COP last year was the head of the national oil company. And you wonder, how could you possibly go? But it's to challenge all of this. Next year, it's in the Brazilian rainforest. And it's not just, the large number of oil lobbyists who come. The largest delegation is the more than 1,000 oil lobbyists. But it's the thousands of people from all parts of the planet who are so desperate and joining together. It's that interconnection that will save us, that will buoy us up. And that's why I'm so excited to, introduce Aneesa. Elizabeth just told you who Aneesa Khan is. But as Aneesa started so early on with youth activism, demanding climate reparations, organizing around the climate talks. She went to College of the Atlantic, where you get a degree in human ecology. This is in her to the core. And Aneesa, you have this wonderful book, Praxis, a graphic novel, where you also tell the story of the life of another of our guests, Nnimmo Bassey. But I was wondering if you could start off by talking about what gives you hope in extremely difficult times, but why you not only continue, you have a remarkable spirit, but you seem to gain energy from these difficult times. What keeps you going? And then if you would share with us some of your graphic novel, because it's magnificent.
Thank you so much, Amy, and hi, everyone. It's such an honor to be here and to be speaking with all of you. I actually want to just start straight away with the graphic novel because it kind of tells the story of why I'm hopeful and what keeps me going today. And so I want to tell you about how I became an artivist and gained hope through this graphic novel, Praxis. So I'm from India, but I was raised in Oman, one of the places at the heart of the fossil fuel industry, and the whole country's economy ran on oil. Oil was about 10 times cheaper than drinking water when I was growing up, but we never talked about the industry or its impacts on the environment, and it was all about individual action. At the same time, I could really see the inklings of the climate crisis back in India, where I'm from. And like you said, I wanted to dive into this. So I got into youth climate activism and joined a group of young climate activists called Earth in Brackets. When I was with Earth in Brackets, I learned about all of the basics of climate justice, and the biggest one being that those on the front lines of this crisis have done the least to cause it. And it was the global north and the fossil fuel industry that were responsible. I also learned about all of these big concepts like emissions having to be cut immediately, countries in the global south needing climate finance, and how we need to stay under 1.5 degrees of warming. Things that all hold true to this day, but also made me lose my mind a little bit because I was stressing out about it. So while I was thinking about this, I had a professor called Doreen, and she read something to us in a class. And it was this quote that said that environmental politics must include praxis, which is a Greek word that means action, but it's action guided by purpose, values, science, and most importantly, ethics. And praxis is what I'd been looking for. And so I started attending the UN climate conferences with all of these other young people and asking really hard questions, such as, how could governments pay $13 trillion to bail out banks in a financial crisis, but put nothing towards climate? And I kept seeing the same thing over and over, which was governments fighting over words in the text when people were already dying from climate change outside the UN halls. So I was in Paris actually when the Paris Agreement came out, and I saw that it didn't reflect the responsibility required of the global north and the reparations required of them. And we were also heading towards a 4-degree warmer world. At the same time, I remember there were massive, massive floods that hit the city that my parents and my family live in India. And our house flooded. I didn't hear from my parents for days, and actually 300 people in our city died. And the juxtaposition of seeing this kind of climate death and crisis against this bureaucratic system made me feel really heartbroken, depressed, and burnt out for a few years, where I stepped away. But then I came across that little book from class again, and that word again. I came across praxis. And this quote that said that structural elements, the outside world, does not need to determine the outcomes or eliminate the potential for praxis or the possibility of change. And then I spent some time looking for the hope to come back to this movement, and found it amongst the people that had been doing this work for much longer than me, the other youth activists who were doing it alongside me, my elders, and the other people on the front lines of the climate crisis who I had a lot to learn from. And so I started to illustrate their stories too. And that's what brought me back to the movement, because, if they're here, then what's my excuse? I also feel really grateful because now I get to do this work full time here at Oil Change International, where I take our hard hitting and sometimes kind of nerdy data and try to illustrate it in different ways, like with these examples that you can see on the slides. And I think what I love about this movement, what gives me hope, is that life has a way of coming full circle. The first person I interviewed to be in my graphic novel is sitting right here on this panel and is a board member at OCI. Nnimmo, someone who inspires me greatly, gives me hope, and deserves a thorough introduction. So I'll try a little bit of my best and tell you what he told me about. He told me about his life in Nigeria as a young boy and as an architect who witnessed African liberation movements. He told me of how he was campaigning for human rights against the military and the oil companies in Nigeria that were harming communities. And he also told me about how it was clear to him that human rights are not enough, and he had to campaign for the environment. He campaigned against Shell with lots of other people, and they kicked Shell out in 1993 and stopped the extraction. But it obviously came at the price of the murder of the Ogoni 9 indigenous group who were fighting against Shell. But that didn't stop him or others. And when he told me this story, it was 2016, and Trump had just been elected for the first time then. And I remember I was in a really bad place mentally because I was really worried about it. And, he told me we couldn't lose hope because of people like Trump. and we needed to keep dealing the hammer blows on the rock with the hope that we will split it one day. And it was people like Nnimmo and many others that keep me going. And so I will let him speak about his own experience.
Thank you so much, Aneesa. I really loved your graphic novel, the one that tells your own story, and of course, the one that tells my story. I was so surprised that you could, in a few pages, capture the whole long life of struggle and very tough circumstances. So I thank you for that. That actually underscores to me that art can give us hope. In my struggle, working with communities who have been absolutely contaminated by crude oil pollution, by gas flaring in the Niger Delta and elsewhere in Africa and beyond, I've found that what communities desperately need is love. And that love is not just, is love for love within the community and love with other beings that we share the planet. But we've seen that generally, there's been such a big disconnect between humans and other beings that we share the planet with, because when I say we, I mean humans tend to think that the planet is just for transformation and for exploitation. And this is why, despite the fact that fossil fuels have caused so much damage to the planet, so much damage to the climate, some people still believe that there's no conceivable way to move away from fossil fuel utilization, despite all the destructions and despite all the wars that is being driven by the search for this resource across the world. But as the last page of your novel, Aneesa, showed a fragment of a poem that I wrote in 1998. I wrote that poem when what happened was that my friends, young people in the Niger Delta, had carried out direct action they called Operation Climate Change. And that really underscored what should be the kind of action we should be carrying out. They went to some oil flow stations and shut down the operations. That immediately brought down gas flares, these giant furnaces that released tons of greenhouse gas into the atmosphere that poisons the people, poisons the communities. And then what resulted from that was, what was the response to that was the military moving in. And of course, some of my friends lost their life in that. So I wrote that poem called We Thought It Was Oil, But It Was Blood. It's dedicated to Ronto Douglas, a youth who did so much within his short lifespan and left very clear marks in the struggle for emancipation and for environmental justice. So I'll just go ahead and read that poem. It's a bit long, but usually when I read it, my audience or those who participate would respond. When I said we thought it was oil, they would respond, but it was blood. But I'm not going to ask you to respond tonight. So I'll just read it on your behalf, and I hope you would understand the story. This was 1998, but it's still very valid today. I recently read this poem in Mauritius at a political ecology school, and then I changed some words, some locations. For example, where you hear me reading the Ogonis, I changed that to the Gazans. And when I mentioned the Jaws, we just change it to other places in the world where you're having genocide and other kinds of atrocities going on. So here's the poem. We thought it was oil, but it was blood. The other day, we danced in the streets, joy in our hearts, we thought we were free. 3 young folks fell to our right, countless more fell to our left. Looking up, far from the crowd, we beheld red-hot guns. We thought it was oil, but it was blood. We thought it was oil, but it was blood. Heart jumping into our mouths, floating on emotions' dry wells. We leapt in fury, but it wasn't funny. Then we beheld bright red pools. We thought it was oil, but it was blood. We thought it was oil, but it was blood. First the Ogonis, today the Jaws. Who will be slain this next day? We see open mouths, we hear no screams. Tears don't flow. When you are scarred, we stand in pools up to our knees. We thought it was oil, but it was blood. Dry tear bags, polluted streams. Things are real when found in dreams. We see their shells behind military shields, evil, horrible, gallows called ricks, drilling our souls. We thought it was oil, but it was blood. We thought it was oil, but it was blood. The heavens are open above our heads. Toasted dreams in a scrambled sky. 1 million black holes in a burnt-out sky. Their pipes may burst, but our dreams won't burst. We thought it was oil, but it was blood. We thought it was oil, but it was blood. They may kill all, but the blood will speak. They may gain all, but the soil will rise. We may die and yet stay alive. Placed on the slab, slaughtered by the day, we are the living, long sacrificed. We thought it was oil, but it was blood. So that was the poem. It was a few years after the execution of Ken Saro-Wiwa and other Ogoni leaders. And, and then, of course, what happened to the young people. But we find this repeating: assault on communities, destruction of environment. And we do know that the reckless dependence on fossil fuels, which is what we challenge continually, which is what Oil Change International challenges, has simply got to stop. We can't just push on because certain industry and certain powerful people can continue to do this with walking behind military shields. So the question that comes to what gives me hope, if I may round this segment up with this, is that even though art may not stop a bullet, as somebody has said before, we can use art to stop polluters. And this is what we must do. We can use art to provoke system change. We can use art to stop and document genocide, ecocide, apartheid, and other barefaced war crimes. We have no option. It's one thing that helps to build hope, to reconnect our humanity to one another and to environment. These are inescapable things that we have to do. Amy, back to you. Thank you so much for moderating this conversation.
Oh, well, it's so wonderful to see you, Nnimmo, and dedicating that to Aranto. Our lives have all intersected in so many different ways. And I first went to Nigeria after meeting Ken Saro-Wiwa, who was executed almost 30 years ago, November 10th, 1995, with other Ogoni activists, because he dared to bring the story of Shell polluting their mangrove forests, taking power from the most powerless people on earth and empowering other powerful countries. And he traveled the world. He came into our little community radio station in New York, WBAI Radio, and he said, "I'm a marked man." And I thought how amazingly brave he was. And that's why I first went to Nigeria, where I met you, where I met Aranto Douglas. And then going to the UN climate summits and seeing you sometimes dragged out of them when you were getting arrested, Nnimmo, that you're an architect, an artist, a longtime activist. I was just wondering, as we go to each panelist, if you can go back, way back in time as a little boy, and how you decided to become a climate activist through thick and thin, through despots, dictatorships, believing that your voice made a difference, that people joining together make a difference.
Well, thank you so much, Abby. Going back memory lane, sometimes I just wonder about the things that were thrown in my way as I grew up. I mean, as a child, I saw civil war in Nigeria, and I really saw abuse of human rights. I saw death. I saw people who were decapitated. I saw, as a young person, we're playing with, instead of playing normal games, we're playing with bullets and stuff like that. And it really, and then it left a lot of marks on me. And I could hear voices, even now, and I still hear voices of people pleading for their lives. And I do know that that war was driven by the drive for certain forces to lay hands on the oil in the Niger Delta. So that was one of the reasons that war happened. And so I never forgot that as I grew up. And then, of course, there was the struggle for independence in parts of Africa, Angola, Mozambique, South Africa, the struggles, in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s. And there was a lot of we had free literature from the liberation movements. And so I fed on that very much. And so as a young person, as an architect working in the public sector, I couldn't really invest all my time, my spare time I invested my spare time in mobilizing and working with other activists. And that's what drew me into the human rights movement in Nigeria. But what happened when we're fighting for better prison conditions, fighting that we shouldn't be detained for more than 2 days without being taken to court? I found that the military, at the behest of oil companies, were leveling whole communities, destroying communities, and then the assault on the Ogoni people. And that just made me to understand that, look, you cannot enjoy human rights in a situation of absolute environmental devastation. The environment of the Niger Delta, by scientific report done by UNEP and by other scientists, shown that almost all the water bodies are contaminated to levels thousands of times above safe standards. And people have to use that water. You have to eat fish from that water. We have to plant crops in soils that are contaminated. And I just told myself, look, until all this is dealt with, the job is not done. And so my life is completely dedicated to this struggle. And so joining up with groups like OCI and other like-minded groups to fight to keep the oil in the soil, leave the coal in the hole, this has become a clear mandate that we cannot escape from.
And from the south to the north, to Oslo, to Norway, Hilja, we're going to hear you perform soon. But right now, if you can talk about art as activism, as you, as a jazz, as a pop, as a folk singer, where your activism around the environment, around ecology, came from.
Thank you so much, Amy, and hello, everyone. So I started with activism in my teenage years. I was part of a youth organization called Naturungdom, Nature and Youth, and did activism, civil disobedience, meeting with politicians, and so on. And for me, for many years, I had I wanted to become a musician. That was sort of my dream, but I had this very strong feeling that that was not good enough because I needed to save the world. And it felt like, or after a while, I ended up sort of thinking of it as a compromise. So in the beginning, my art felt like a very lonely process in a way. Where I needed music to express my feelings of hopelessness and despair and sorrow for the state of the world. But then as I started sharing my music with other people, it has become now something that brings me a lot of hope, because it brings me this sort of feeling of community that I had in my teenage years that I've missed a lot as an adult, which I've not been for a very long time, I must say. But yeah, there's an age limit. I couldn't be in Nature and Youth any longer, and so I've really missed this community. And I've, in a way, felt that I've found it through music, playing at demonstrations and protest camps, and finding community through music. I've also recently joined an activist choir with other artists singing at subway stations in the morning, which has been a really wholesome experience. We sing songs of peace and drink coffee. And to me, that's been a very nice example of how there are big actions and small actions, and the small ones are also really important and can also bring a lot of hope.
And I was wondering, just going back to talk about process, I wanted to bring Rebecca Solnit back into the conversation. You've written so elegantly, so movingly about mutual support. You know, not one group of people or not one country saving another, but what that means. And if you can go back in time and talk about how you became an activist. I mean, you've written dozens of books, but what got you started? Your own family inspiring you as well, you and your brother doing such great work.
I grew up with some activism around me. My mom did fair housing work for Black people coming to our racist community in the 1960s. My aunt, my Bohemian aunt, was an environmental and anti-war activist. And I started myself partly by supporting my younger brother, who would always sign up to do the newsletter for these Central America anti-intervention groups and things, and then be like, Rebecca, I signed up to do the newsletter. And I'd be like, David, bring it over. I was an editor and copy editor and like could get the words in order and proofread, etc. And but the thing I really did on my own, well, one of them was feminism, which was really something I've mostly done as a writer. The other was I started volunteering, and I volunteered with Rainforest Action Network in the late 80s, which was an incredibly exciting moment for that organization and the organizations around it, when the white environmental movement had to acknowledge that a lot of what we wanted to protect, all of what we wanted to protect really was indigenous land. It wasn't wilderness, it was homeland. And that also got me involved in indigenous land rights. And there's lots more to the story. But the interconnection of all these things, of seeing how much what we oppose is the politics of division, segregation, apartheid, how much what we support is what Thich Nhat Hanh might call interbeing, what an environmentalist might call a kind of systemic world of interconnection, reciprocity, etc. So, there's so many bits and pieces in my own story that kind of exemplify that come together to put me where I am now as a feminist, a climate activist, a supporter of indigenous rights, and a person always excited to try and perceive the patterns and relationships that underlie these things.
You know, as we move into a new era in the United States, going back in time and forward, as President Trump was already president, and it seems no matter what he talks about, so often he ends his sentence by saying, drill, baby, drill. But you've written books on natural disasters, times of absolute catastrophe. Yet you see great hope being born out of this. And I think that's a very good metaphor for what we are encountering right now. And I'm wondering if you can talk about that.
Yeah, my hope really comes from three things. One of which is our enemies would love us to say it's hopeless, to give up, to say we have no power. And part of me is just like, I'm not going to give them the satisfaction. And Timothy Snyder says, do not obey in advance, and do not obey when it's no longer advanced. Do not, don't surrender in advance, don't surrender during, don't surrender. But also, on the one hand, we don't know what's going to happen. And if I told somebody a month ago that the horrible incel president of South Korea would try and stage a coup, but civil resistance would push it back. And by the way, the same week, the Assad regime would fall after 54 years. Nobody saw, so much of what's coming. People thought Ukraine would be conquered in a week. We live in a world looking forward of radical unpredictability. We live in a world looking back that tells us to expect the unexpected, that ordinary people together have extraordinary power, which is why those we call the powerful fear us. So the historical record and that clarity in the past and the radical lack of clarity, the mystery of the future, together with a certain amount of contrariness, keep me hopeful or resolute in the face of what we're dealing with.
Aneesa, your great art through graphic novels, you do that and so much more. And you really fight for people all over the planet. I'm wondering how you really got your start, and if you could give some real life examples. One of the examples I was thinking about was the climate case being brought by Pacific Island nations to the United Nations and the International Court of Justice, and about in the United States, young people who are suing, for example, the state of Montana, saying, you're stealing our future from us, and actually winning.
Yeah, sorry. So you want me to talk about my beginnings?
Yes.
Yeah, definitely. So I think like I shared in the graphic novel, a lot of my beginnings came just organizing with other young people from around the world. And I think that when we go to the, up, and I was organizing at the UN climate conferences, and often what we see there is this issue where, countries in the global north who are historically responsible for the climate crisis take up a lot of space, have a lot of power in influencing the conversation. The fossil fuel industries often has a seat at the table in a way that, everyday people who are facing the climate crisis do not. And so a lot of that time was spent kind of coming together with young people from around the world, including, people from Hilja's group that she was talking about. Natarag Ungdom were people that I was organizing with 10 years ago as well. And, I think that it really was watching these other young people kind of put everything on the line and come together, especially young people from communities where, the climate crisis is an everyday reality for them, is what kind of got me into this and kept me going. And myself being one of those young people, I don't think that the climate crisis is an option for me. It's a reality. It's a reality for my family. It's not something that I get to look at and say, I don't want to do this, because I think that every single life is so precious, and every single life that we save is so precious and deserves it. And I don't think there's the option to not do that. And I think that for me, I'm on this planet to create art that, comforts the disturbed and disturbs the comfortable, as they say. And
Can you talk about something that went really wrong, but that you were, and groups you were involved with, were able to challenge and change?
Yeah, definitely. I think I remember actually really clearly being in Paris at the climate talks, and remembering that, the Paris Agreement was going to come out without any language with the number 1.5, which is a tipping point, which is a number that we are definitely going to cross, because of all of these powers that be that we're challenging. And I remember being there and hearing that this wasn't going to happen, and watching all the activists occupy kind of the center of the conference center, chanting, which not anymore chanting 1.5 to stay alive, but actually chanting 1.5, we might survive, And I remember sitting there for hours and hours that night chanting that, and then seeing that number in the agreement that, earlier I did say did not reflect kind of the responsibility and reparations needed of global North countries. But at the same time, it then, having that number in there gives us something to hold people accountable to, and to say, this is enshrined in here, and it's actually a number that shouldn't be crossed and cannot afford to be crossed.
I want people to think of questions for these wonderful, inspirational climate leaders. Often the way the Western world, and particularly people in the United States, talk is about what we can teach the world, how we can lead the world. But Nnimmo Bassey, I think you have so much to teach us from the most populous country in Africa, from Nigeria, which has taken on that nexus of corporate and government power. You have oil companies that shore up corrupt governments, and then the corrupt governments cracking down on the people who fight for equality and for clean air. And I think of Chevron, using Nigeria's military to attack climate activists who are just sick of their land being polluted in the Niger Delta. And I was wondering if you can talk to people back, for example, in the United States, as we see a time when billionaires, large unregulated corporations are going to, it's not just join with, but kind of merge with the government. What kind of lessons you've learned about the most effective pressure points?
Wow, what a tough question. But I must say that it's really scary watching what is going on in the United States. It's like I can't call it tale of the unexpected. It's more or less what you can always expect to happen in a situation where democracy is something that needs to be redefined, and where people power has to take another shape, and not what can be manipulated what can be achieved or presented the way we're seeing it happening. So I come from and work in a situation where there's that close link between the military and the politicians, the military and the oil companies, of course, the politicians. And there's complete disdain for the environment, a complete disregard of the lives of people. And I think it's the same thing everywhere. It may have different colorations, but when we see the kind of activities, the kind of decisions being made around the world, I think we can see a thread running through all these policy and decision makers who don't have a disregard for Mother Earth and who don't really care what happens to the poor. In fact, if they had their way, the poor should all be eliminated so that only a few could enjoy the planet. I think we've tried naming and shaming, litigation, all those things, and with success to some level. But I do think that what we need, the pressure point now, is to directly attack the imaginaries of these people who pretend to be impervious to public pressure. We need to show how foolish their actions really are. And like somebody wants to burn down the house to inherit the ashes. Doesn't just make sense at all. We need to, on our own, we need to re-engineer, pardon me to use that term, technical, kind of mechanical term. We need to reformulate the way we come together. We need to use more of artistic expression. This is why my poetry is mostly for activism. Unfortunately, it's not for pleasure. I would like to write poems for pleasure, of course, but a whole lot, including my newest collection, which is I See the Invisible, talks about greed, talks about convenience, and these are the things that are driving the dependence on fossil fuels and the wars that we see around us. So we just need to intensify our efforts with direct action and with exposing the foolishness of the kind of arguments that we're seeing coming from the sector that wants to perpetuate this very, very system that is setting the world on fire.
And Hilja, before we go to questions from everyone, I see they're putting them into chat. If you can talk about, and especially in your art, which is so personal, but also political and powerful, your singing, your music, if you can talk about putting personal things out into the world through your activism.
Yes, I can try to talk about that. That's something it's such a big question in my life, also because I've had this journey of starting this place where I felt like I had to write political music. If I were to write or release music at all, it had to be political. And now sort of I've now, especially through my music studies, reflected a lot upon the role of art in society, and also thought about how these things are also connected, and our overconsumption and overstimulation, it's all part of the same problem in a way. And for me now, art has also become sort of, it's very hard to say it in English, but it's sort of become a symbol of a way of life that we are moving away from, that we need to reconnect with. So I hope that art can in itself be of value and be inspirational, even when it's not clearly political. And I write both things, I would say. Yes, I still struggle with these things, and but I found it very nice to read the chat and see a lot of people that also write political stuff. I think it's inspiring to know that other people also do it. I feel it's something that's sort of becoming a bigger thing. Yes. I don't have to answer your question.
I think you did. I think you did. Would you like to, now we're going to hear from you later, but would you like to sing something a cappella to us now? To surprise you with that question?
Yes, that's a surprise. I can try and think of something to sing.
And if you're going to sing it in another language, if you could tell it what it is, what you're singing before you sing it.
Okay, this is a very interesting challenge. I can sing a song by a Norwegian artist, which is one of the most famous one from the 70s, called Lillebjørn Nilsen. Which
You're very brave.
Thank you. I think so too. And he's a Norwegian legend and a pioneer in like the basically political folk singing in Norway. And this is a song that I don't know how to translate it, but it's about how we come from the earth and we end up in the earth. So I will sing a verse from that song. Denne jorda skal gi deg mat. I need to find the lyrics actually, even though most of you don't understand it.
Well, listen, I'll tell you what we'll do. We're going to go to some questions. It'll give you time to find the music. I hate to put you on the spot, but even just what I just heard, I'm really looking forward to another stanza. But I want to turn to Lopa, who is going to read some of the questions from people who are joining with us today and continue the conversation. But Hilja, we're not going to let you off the hook.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Hilja, and thank you to all of our panelists. So we have a bunch of questions, and they're all fantastic. So I'm just going to go in order of when they came in. So Emma would like to know, what type of storytelling and messaging in art do the panelists believe is most attention-grabbing and belief-shifting for a general public audience who may not be so attentive to the climate crisis?
If nobody else is going to jump in, I will. I think stories that remind people they're powerful are really important, and stories that remind them that we can win because we have before. There's a lot of defeatism and despair, and obviously there's a basis for them as feelings. At Not Too Late, we started saying we respect despair as an emotion, but not as an analysis. There's always something worth doing, always something anybody who isn't in prison or otherwise directly oppressed can do. So, those stories that remind us of possibility and power.
Yeah, I can add to that. I think it's also the stories that remind people of themselves. And I think when we're talking to people that have the same kind of mindset as us or talking across the aisle, it's about picking those things that everyone can agree on. Everybody wants their families to be safe. Everyone wants their families to be loved, to have safe places to live, clean air, clean water. It's kind of speaking to those common values that we share across the board as human beings that can also really help in pulling people in storytelling.
And if I may jump into that to that question, there's a poem I wrote called "I Come from the Future," and it really is because I believe that stories that take us into the future to see how rotten the situation is because of what we do today can be very helpful. Because then we'll see how difficult it is to retrace our steps to repair what is broken. I also think we can do stories that that places other beings in a position of decision making. Like if you have animals or birds going to climate conference, for example, I believe that the decision we make quickly. You won't have to wait for COP29, COP30. Within one COP, there will be a solution. So I think we can just show that humans are not as brilliant as we are. Maybe that would bring in some level of humility among us.
The next question is actually for Hilja. Can you explain how young people organize in nature and youth? Why is it so important to allow youth voices to be heard without adult control?
That's a very good question. Nature and Youth is a organization for all of Norway, and as you may know, Norway is a very long and thin country. So, and we are not very many people. So, it's a really great way, really, to connect people from all over the country, and that's, I think, also in a small country like Norway, it's not really hard or easy necessarily to find like-minded people. So people from these like tiny villages can come to these countrywide arrangements and work together and do a lot more than they could on their own. And regarding the no adults, I think that's the best part about Nature and Youth, really, because it gives a lot of it kind of reminds me of what was just said, really, that a lot of empowerment, I guess, to young people. And I think I've definitely never had more hope in a good future than when I was 16 and working with these other people, because we could do anything. It was crazy. We could, it really felt like that. And I think it also kind of, there's something special about a bunch of young, naive people working together, where because of this feeling of there's no limits, that brings out a lot of crazy ideas, and there's no one there to say that's not possible. So then we just do it, and a lot of times it doesn't work, but sometimes it does. Yeah, I think that's really important, and it's a really good learning opportunity to be able to, at such a young age, arrange these things.
Thank you, Hilja. The next question is for Lee, is from Lee. It's for Nnimmo. Can you speak to the ecofeminism of the Niger Delta women's movement of old and today? Not only women, but those working to transform ecological and social relationships.
Oh, wow. I think the women of the Niger Delta are true climate champions. They are also those who have stood very resolutely against oil corporations and their atrocious activities. And this is because they have very high level of ecological consciousness, and they also work very closely. They depend on, of course, the natural environment, and they are very sacrificial in their action. I've seen with the women very holistic approaches to tackling the problems from the feminist perspective in a very highly patriarchal society. And the women have in the past, historically, when I say historical, I'm talking about maybe 20 years ago, 25 years ago, they've put everything on the line, including naked option, to shame the oil corporations and force governments to speak up and do something about their situation. And recently, they're also using scientific methods. The first oil wells in the Niger Delta were drilled in the 1950s. And some of those first oil wells were abandoned without being decommissioned in the 1970s. Now, recently, one of the feminist groups in the Niger Delta conducted blood tests for the women, 80 women in that community, where the first oil well was drilled in 1956. And they found that in their red blood cells, they all had traces of hydrocarbon. And, that is really very scary. And now they're using the research, the outcome of the test, to campaign for reparation and for restoration and for action in those communities. And I think I just love I love the trajectory that the feminists in the region are pushing. The eco-feminists are pushing the actions against the system. But what still surprises me is the level of sacrifice, where the women, apart from fighting for their health, everything else they're fighting for is for their children and for their families, which is something about the interconnectedness that we can learn from.
Thank you, Nnimmo. Okay, so the next question is from Katerina. So she has two questions, so I'm going to ask them both. So the first question is for all the panelists. In what ways is oil abuse leading to humans' abuse of each other in relationship? And then the other question she has is about the platforms. I think they're kind of related, so I'm asking them together. Is that the platforms that we are using, digital environments and tools to create activist communities whilst knowing the ethical/environmental implications of these technologies, how do our guests reconcile and navigate these ethical questions? So feel free to jump in on either one of those.
I was wondering if I could say something, stepping out of my role as moderator.
Absolutely.
But, we do a daily show called Democracy Now!, a grassroots, global, independent, international investigative news hour, and we're hitting 29 years now. And we began on 9 stations, now we're on 1,500 and on platforms, every social media platform. So why do I bring this up? Because from the beginning, we made a critical decision, which was we would not take money from corporations, when we're covering climate change, not turn to the oil, gas, the coal, the nuclear industry. When we cover war and peace, we don't turn to the military contractors. We turn to the people who want the information and say, if you believe that this kind of media makes a difference in the way you see the world, we ask you to support it. And people said that would never last. Networks come from around the world to Democracy Now!, broadcasters, and say, we know private media, we know public media, but what are you talking about viewer, listener, reader supported? But the reason is because independent media is critical to covering all of these movements. We cannot compromise there. And I think that, I was thinking about Vanessa Nakate of Uganda and how there was this picture, I think AP took it, people may remember it, one of the climate summits, and it was a group of young women who were just standing there, and they wanted to show the young women activists. except they cut her out. And it was only the other women who were white. And to her credit, she said, this is not right. And she said, you've got to expand the frame. And because it was one person, I think, and often, things affect millions of people, but when we tell one person's story, it was such an important illustration that we have to expand the frame. I see the media as a huge kitchen table that stretches across the globe, that we all sit around and debate and discuss the most important issues of the day. And it's got to be brought to us by the very same people and critters from around the planet that benefit from that information, and not from the corporations that close the window.
Thank you so much, Amy. Does anyone else have any responses to those questions? Well, go ahead, Nnimmo.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Amy, for that intervention. Really, we need to expand the frame all the time to ensure that our voices are heard and that we're seen and not invisibilized. So I want to try to address the question that says about whether oil abuse leads to human abuse of each other. I think there's a direct connection, because with the degradation of environment by fossil fuel extraction, we're directly impacting those who utilize that environment, and of course globally through climate change. And the more the environment is abused, the more there's abuse between humans who are affected by the environmental abuse. I'm saying this because it's been, I believe, it is often very visible that the way anybody who cares for nature, who cares for the environment, who care for his neighbor, who care for the next person, will be kind and more loving and more generous to other people. But anyone who's just looking for oil is about power, it's about abuse, it's about mythology, because a whole lot of the argument that oil is cheap is just false, because oil is really expensive. Oil is the blood of the earth. It's the blood, as what people say, is the blood of people who are dying in the oil fields. And so human abuse of each other, especially when I say human now, talk about those who are driving, those who are drilling and polluting, not just every human. And so we may have to say the oil corporations and those who drive that process, the policymakers who work with them, they are really directly abusing others. Maybe not each other, but they're abusing others who have to suffer the consequences of their degrading activities.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nnimmo. So, I also just want to take the time to point out that OCI also does not take corporate support for all of these very reasons, which is why your support is so important. So thank you. Let's see. It's like we have two more. I've been thinking about how, this is from Denise. I've been thinking about how important grieving all who have been lost, killed, and silenced as we welcome other worlds, creating safe spaces to mourn, while we also keep fighting as artists and creatives. How do you think mourning can be included in our movements? And then I just want to point out we have one more question after that I would love to cover, and then we'll wrap up this section. But yeah, anybody have an answer to the question about mourning, which is, I think, a really important part of this work?
Nnimmo, was that you ready to go? I saw your arm, but I don't hear you. Ooh, now the camera's on me. The Wobblies and Joe Hill once said 100 years ago, don't mourn, organize. But I don't think it's either or. I think our organizing is a form of mourning in that it honors and remembers who has suffered, who has been deprived, who has lost their rights, who has lost their land, who has lost their life, and that grief and hope can coexist. Since I don't think of hope as an emotion, I think of it as an analysis and a commitment. But in a sense, you honor the people who suffered by addressing the cause of that suffering, because the suffering isn't in the past tense, it's in the present, and our goal is to make it not in the future. So I see, in a sense, mourning is almost our motivation. We acknowledge the harm that has been done in our efforts to try and prevent more of it and to bring back some kind of justice, accountability, equality, inclusion, audibility. So that would be my answer. Mourn and organize. And other answers welcome.
Okay, just a quick addition to that. Thank you so much for that already. Just to say that mourning is also, I agree completely. It's a recognition, the fact that it's a loss, and sometimes oppressors. For example, in the Ogoni, when the Ogoni people were under the assault of the military in Nigeria, they banned mourning. People were not allowed to mourn. So mourning was an act of resistance. And it could be also an act of a process by which we organize and gather people together, because everybody has a right to mourn, to cry, and just looking, refusing to erase the pain created by, by the demise of our friends and relatives. So mourning is positive; it's not negative.
Great, thank you, Nnimmo. So I'm gonna kind of wrap things up here. Amy, if that is okay. Thank you. Thank you so much, Amy, and all of the panelists. I just want to read out one last comment from Stephanie, because I think it's really important. I write novels in addition to nonfiction for all-purpose activism, and often find myself writing about struggles in countries that are not my land. I obviously cannot tell the story from a local perspective, but I also don't want to have a white Western protagonist. It's probably better to write a novel about a situation that hasn't been spotlighted than not to do so, and explore the issues from multiple perspectives, viscerally, poetically, etc. But I always struggle with the question of voice and perspective, in case anyone has thoughts or any reflections on this issue. But thanks to all of you for your brilliant, courageous, and beautiful work. And thank you, Stephanie, for that. I think as artists, that's what, that's something that everyone struggles with. So yeah, thank you to all the panelists. Thank you so much to Amy. And I think I will just really quickly pass it back to Amy to say bye and to bring Hilja back on.
Oh,
No, sorry. My mistake. Didn't mean to put you on the spot. We're actually going to Elizabeth now, but I do want to, now that we have you spotlighted, just say thank you once again.
thank you so much. And Zazu, my little news hound, also wishes everyone a safe and healthy new year.
Great, and don't go away. We are still going to have Hilja. I think maybe you get to choose either sing or play your video at the end. So, yeah, so don't leave yet. I also want to thank everyone. This was an amazing conversation and so inspiring. I think we have a slide. This webinar is part of our year-end fundraising efforts for Oil Change International. So I do want to ask for your support. So please consider giving a donation to Oil Change's work this year end. We've got a global team of 45 staff around the world who works really hard to facilitate a phase out of fossil fuels and a just transition to clean energy. And so you can take your phone and scan the QR code here, or you can go to oilchange.org/donate and give there, or you can mail a check. There's an address here or on our website. And if you're already an OCI supporter and you've already given this year, thank you so much. If you haven't given this year end yet, please take this opportunity. And if you have never supported Oil Change, this is a great year to do that. We are in this work for the long haul. We're going to keep standing up and fighting, and we would truly appreciate your support this year. We're also looking towards 2025, which is going to be our 20th anniversary year. And after 2 decades, we're going strong and we're all in. Any size gift helps. We appreciate whatever you're able to give. We also really appreciate all of you for being here, your attention, your enthusiasm. There are so many people who are on this call today who bring your own art and activism to this movement, and we appreciate being in community with you. So thank you all so much. And I'll just very quickly wanted to share some websites for Aneesa's book, Stuart Hall Foundation, Rebecca's book and initiative, nottoolateclimate.com. We have Nnimmo's Health of Mother Earth Foundation, homef.org. I know he also has his own personal website, which we don't have here, but I think has been shared in the chat. And of course, Democracy Now, democracynow.org. What an amazing independent news independent news organization. And Hilja, I want to turn it over to you to talk a bit about your song and share with us.
Thank you so much. I will first send the title of the song that I was about to sing by Lillebjørn Nilsen, so everyone can listen to that afterwards if they want to. And then it's an honor to get to close off this event with this very inspiring panel. The song that I will be sharing today is called Fjorden er ikke vår, which can be translated to The Fjord is Not Ours. And the theme of the song is how nature is not to be owned by anyone, and therefore also not for us to destroy. And I wrote this as a response to plans of dumping mining waste directly into a Norwegian fjord. So I wrote it while I was in a protest camp. I stayed in a tent for a week and showered in the very clean fjord. Yes, the first part of the song is a reference to a very important environmental case in Norwegian history called the Alta case, where the indigenous community and the environmental movement worked together to stop plans to destroy the Alta River. And the song says, "The river is not ours." And in the second part of the song, I reflect upon how we are still fighting the same battles, and some things have definitely not changed. And now we are saying the fjord is not ours, but we are fighting the same battle. And in that part of the song, if you look very carefully in the video, you will see me and my husband getting arrested together, fighting for this fjord. Yes. And the reason why that's true love, yes, I agree. The reason why I wanted to share this specific song with you all today and to close up this event with the song is because this has brought me so much hope. And I think the reason for that is because it's become a song that I typically sing together with other people. So at concerts, I always ask the audience if they want to join me singing in like a real 70s sing-along style. And oftentimes people start singing also without me asking, which brings me a lot of joy. And I've played it at countless demonstrations and protest camps, and I feel that this song really has become sort of part of the fight for our fjords in Norway. And that has been really meaningful to me to see how it can also bring hope to other people and to know that we are not alone. So I'm very honored to get to share this song with you today, and thank you so much. And now we will listen to Fjorden er ikke vår.
「 har fortalt at folk har kjempet denne kampen fra lenge før jeg ble født. Et annet sted, en annen tid, men med samme drøm om å få lov å prøve å ta vare på det vi har fått, men som aldri kan bli vårt. Og de sa elva er ikke vår, så vær så snill og la den leve. Man skulle kanskje tro vi hadde lært noe siden 1982. Bare se på alt vi vet, og alt som skjer, for verden er et annet sted enn den var da. Og vi har ikke fått noe mer å ta. Fjorden er ikke vår, men vi vet at vi er mange som står sammen for å kreve at fjorden må få leve.
Vi blir jo aldri ferdig med det. Vi er jo litt forskjellige, og det får litt forankret i oss at vi blir jo aldri ferdig med det.
Fjorden er ikke vår, fjorden er ikke vår, fjorden er ikke vår, fjorden er ikke vår, fjorden er ikke Så vær så snill og la den leve.